This is my car, and while I was making a hit this past weekend, a bit of misfortune happened. As I was trying to do some spirited driving, right about as it started, I noticed that the car started spinning a little bit and traction control came on. I found this super strange since, it was like so hot outside as the weather's above the 90s. So I let off and then attempted another hit while slowly rolling in at about half throttle. This time the car fishtailed a bit. So now, right about this time, my spidey senses, man, they started tingling because I put two and two together since there was no way I wasn't able to hook at 50 miles an hour on a 90-degree day. And, I knew something I got wrong. I quickly exited the road to get to a safe place to check out the car, and this is when I noticed something that had really gone wrong. I noticed my coolant and oil temps were quickly rising beyond the usual levels, and it was clear that you know, at this point, I started worrying about something more serious happening, and I stopped the car on the shoulder and cut it off. I saw oil temps were about 265 before I turned off the engine, and I'd also thought I'd heard a bit of a ticking or clunking sound right about before I cut the engine off. When I got out of the car, um, my fears were kind of realized because there was a big puddle of fluid quickly growing under the vehicle. My mind immediately went through like the worst possible scenarios, but after walking around the car a little bit and checking out the spill, all I could see was coolant. So it was a little bit of a relief. So after about more than an hour of waiting, a tow truck finally arrived, and I was able to get the car back to a garage so I could look at it. Fortunately, I'm very grateful to my buddy Zhang because he was nearby and drove over so we could wait in his car while the tow truck arrived. And because by this point the weather temps had gone up to about 100 degrees, and it was super hot outside, and there's barely any shade over there where I was parked. So anyway, long story, right? But once we got the car in the garage, a couple other buddies showed up, and we took on the difficult task of aligning the car onto the lift and pushing it back and forth since I didn't want to risk turning on the engine without really understanding what had gone wrong. At this point, I started tearing down the under trays and the plastic trims beneath the vehicle, and we quickly saw that one of the hoses to the auxiliary radiator had ripped apart. Um, for those that don't know, the C7 has a auxiliary radiator uh, beneath, sitting parallel to the ground, beneath the your main radiator. So but anyway, the hose connection going to this thing had like ripped apart, and there was a coolant spill that just come out. Everything in the coolant system had come out. Um, but from what I could see from that point on, the initial prognosis was good because we didn't see any oil leaks. There was no other like there was no oil on the ground anywhere when we towed the car. So all we saw so far was coolant, and I guess that was kind of a bit of a relief. Now I did notice that before I turned the car off earlier, that my oil pressure had dipped like well below 30, which usually doesn't happen. And while that had me worried initially, thinking through it later, that made sense since the hotter the engine block got, that would mean that the oil would get thinner and thereby would be lowering the pressure reading. So, anyway, it was too hot that day, so I didn't really start fixing the car, and I waited till the next day because I needed to get some 5/8 inch hose, which was what I needed to replace. And then once I did that, I started doing the repair. After getting the new hose in place, I pressurized the system to for about 45 minutes. And fortunately, there was no loss of pressure. So that means that was the only breakage in the coolant loop that we had just fixed. And everything was good. So in retrospect, now I probably could have stopped there, refilled the car with coolant and called it a day, and everything would have been fine. But you know, I was paranoid of what I thought I had heard before turning off the engine. So I decided to go ahead and start taking off some pieces from the engine bay. And by pieces, I mean like trim, because what I wanted to do was uh, get the spark plugs out and then put an endoscope and check out the cylinder chambers. So make sure there wasn't any damage and then I hadn't heard anything crazy in there. When I started taking out the plugs, and after I got the plugs out, um, I was pretty happy. I consulted some friends, and they all looked at the photos, and they said that the old plug looked pretty good. Um, the set had about 12K miles on them at this point, and just for my sanity, I did have a endoscope, which is like a little camera on a cable that we could put through the spark plug hole and then look inside the cylinder chambers. Um, Video feed came back pretty good, and I didn't see anything worrisome. Cross hatches were still visible on cylinder walls, and I was pretty happy at this point. But since I'd done all the work already of taking out the spark plugs, I thought it would be the appropriate time to grab some new ones. And I bought the same set, and I run Brisk RR10S. That's 3 steps colder than OEM. And these are non-projected silver electrode plugs, which I proceeded to gap to 0.028 inches. Now, if you guys are doing your own plugs on your own vehicle and get pre-gap kind, which is usually what most spark plugs are nowadays, they're come pre-gapped. It's always good to check the actual gap, since you don't always get what's advertised. Additionally, if you guys are running iridium plugs, I recommend you use a feeler gauge instead of the typical coin-based gauge to measure gap, since iridium electrodes tend to be more fragile than the copper or silver types. So finally, I was satisfied. There was no issues with the block. I started buttoning everything up. I did a vacuum test finally, on the coolant system. And this is part of just vacuum filling the coolant system, because I had the tools for that, so might as well. And then once we got done with that, it was finally time to turn on the car. Now, so the car turned on, and there was no funny clunking noises, which was a big win. However, quickly noticed there was still an issue. The motor was idling very rough, and the car was shaking. And I mean, like, it was shaking, man. Like, I know I have a custom cam in this engine, but it's not that kind of cam. So consensus was there's probably a misfire happening, and either one of the plugs that I put in was bad or damaged, or I just probably not connected something in all the way upon reassembly. So at this point, it was pretty late the next day, and it's super hot in the garage still, and I wanted to wait till the next day, so I packed up, went home. The next day, I called up my tuner, Justin White, and I asked him to send me a diagnostic tune to load on the vehicle and have him check out the car. So after doing that, we discovered that cylinder number 3 was misfiring excessively, and this is actually good because this narrowed down my job quite a bit. I went back in, and as I was taking the plastic valve cover trim to get access to the coil packs and the plug wires, the number 3 cylinder wire just like fell out, and I was like, well, oh shit, that's probably it, right? Just kind of went back and double checked my work and made sure that put a little bit more force in there to get the plugs in place. And once we did that, turned on the car again, and everything was just smooth, beautiful, sounded great the way it's supposed to, and it looks like everything was kosher.